Like George. This is a true story of resilience that taught me one of life's greatest lessons. While this story is true, some of the details have been softened, as the real story might be too graphic for some listeners, and to keep the focus on the great lesson. I adopted George the gray tabby cat when he was just a little baby kitten. I will never forget that day. I went to the animal shelter just to see what they might have. There were several cages filled with adorable cats of all ages, shapes, colors, and sizes. I wish I could adopt them all, but I lived in an apartment with a 2-cat maximum and already had a great cat named Francis the Wonder Cat, so I would only be able to adopt one. As I walked through the shelter, I found one cage separated from all the others in a room all by itself. And there he was, a tiny tiger. I knew from the moment I saw him that he would be mine. I told the lady at the shelter I wanted to take him home with me, and she said that little kitten was actually being fostered and wasn't up for adoption. I pleaded with her until she finally gave in and let me take him home. George was a wild one from the moment I met him, so curious and energetic, always looking for adventure. Francis the Wonder Cat didn't know what to think of this wild young whippersnapper, but she fell in love with him pretty quickly, and they became fast friends. George was an indoor cat for his first couple of years, until I moved into a house where he had a nice yard to explore. The first time I let him out, I was terrified that he would take off and run away, so I fashioned a harness and a leash for him made of rope I had laying around. Took him outside, sat him down on the grass, and grabbed hold of his leash, just waiting for him to take off. Only George just sat there looking up at the sky in amazement, as if to say, "Where's the ceiling in this room?" It took him a day or two to get used to the great outdoors, but then he was off and running. The world was his playground. He climbed every tree he could find, chased every squirrel and chipmunk, and ran faster than any cat I'd ever seen. George was in his element in the great outdoors. One day, George went out for his daily adventure and didn't come back. I was so worried about him. But I knew how tough George was and knew he could outrun any other animal, so I tried not to worry. The next day, I had to go to work, even though George still had not returned. It was a difficult day wondering where he was. When I finally returned home, I went into my bedroom and found George curled up on the bed. I was so relieved. But as I walked over to him to give him lots of love pets and ask him where he'd been, I could see he was bleeding pretty badly from his front leg. So I scooped him up and rushed him to the vet. He didn't seem to be in a lot of pain, but he was quite listless from the blood loss, I can only assume. They took him back, and I waited nervously in the waiting room for their verdict on what was wrong. Obviously, he had gotten into some kind of trouble when he was out roaming the neighborhood. How long had he been injured? I felt so hopeless waiting to find out what was going on. Finally, the doctor came out and said he had sustained a severe injury to his leg, and it would need to be amputated. My heart dropped to my feet. I told him to do whatever he needed to do to save my sweet George. So he went back to the back, and I sat down and cried. How would my sweet George get around with only 3 legs? Surely he wouldn't be able to have the fun and adventuresome life he was used to any longer. My heart was breaking for him. But if the doctor could at least save his life, that would be a miracle. My thoughts just kept coming back to thinking of how George loved to outrun all the other animals in the neighborhood, climb the tallest trees, and generally just get into all kinds of stuff. What kind of life would he possibly have without his front leg? Would he even be able to walk? All I could do was just pray and hope and send George all my love from the waiting room. About an hour later, they told me he had come through the operation okay and was likely going to be just fine. I was so relieved to hear that, but still very concerned about George's livelihood. I had to wait a good while longer before they would let me back to see him. They said the anesthesia needed to wear off first. Eventually, they took me back to see him, and to my surprise, he looked over at me and immediately stood up and hopped on his 3 legs towards me. He didn't seem bothered at all that he had lost a leg. He just wanted all the love pets and snuggles as always. I took George home and watched him heal fully, and it's as if he never missed a beat, as if he'd always only had 3 legs. You see, unlike many of us humans, George wasn't concerned with what he'd lost. He was too busy appreciating all that he had and doing whatever he could with what he had. He went on to live a fun life full of adventure for another 10 years, albeit slightly different than his younger 4-legged days, but exciting just the same. Losing his leg only presented him with a new challenge, and George was always up for a challenge. In later years, I too would come to lose some abilities I once had due to an accident. But I kept the memory of George in the forefront of my mind and have managed to persevere over those challenges thanks to the lesson George had taught me. George showed me that life is ever-changing and presenting new challenges to overcome, but that just adds more color to our life's portrait. We can wallow in what we've lost and miss out on the blessings of every day. Or we can say, oh well, look what else I can do now, and embrace each day we are given with our whole heart and focus on our blessings, knowing that there is a world of limitless possibilities just waiting for us to explore. I challenge you to put down your losses and pick up your blessings. Forge a new path forward that is one filled with inspiration that you can share with others. This world needs your special light that only you can shine. Things are always looking up if you look for them to. So keep looking up and be like George.